This is panel 3, which the title is Biology, Nutrition, and Learning, What the Report Did Not Say. We're going to structure, though, our conversations based more around the expertise of the members of our panel. I'm Dr. Carolyn Grasse-Bachman from Penn State Harrisburg. My teaching area is human development and family studies, so I come at this topic from a family perspective. With me on the panel are Dr. Zayaitz, who will speak a bit about the area of nutrition, be able to look at that with us. Dr. John Conahan, beside me, also sociology and family, and Professor Lindsey Runell, who will look at some of the structural issues that we've already talked about. So we're going to begin with some comments by Dr. Conahan on looking at sociology from a sociology perspective.
Good morning. I have a couple prepared remarks here, and my discipline is social work, and from that perspective, I kind of look at things a bit differently. And I just put this into context. There's a couple takeaways from the Moynihan report, and I think it's really important to look at the context upon which this has occurred. And the first one, there's about 5 or 6. One, that family structure of the African American family, the black family at that time, was a matriarchal system. That's the first takeaway. The second one was very few African Americans were progressing and acquiring middle class affluence. That translates into, for me at least, is you need to be more like us. And there's something, us being the white majority. Female-headed households were producing more juvenile delinquents and less well-educated children. So now we're also blaming the matriarchal system. And then family structure was fundamental in contributing factor for the prevalence of, I think the term he used was tangle pathology, to define this convergence of dynamics that were occurring, which produced a flawed family structure. So, and blacks must assimilate if they're going to progress into a white class norms. And lastly, black women must step out. They must step out of this role, leader, educator, champion, advocate, and become, allow the men to step in. Now, if you look back on that, I mean, I don't know how many folks were thinking cognitively in 1965. I mean, that was the era I grew up. I grew up in the 50s, in the 60s. And that makes total sense. I remember that. All you got to do is watch Mad Men, and you get a nice Hollywood version of the culture at the time. And as you fast forward to today, the issues that Moynihan identified were discussed long before him. I mean, they were discussed by Franklin Frazier, one of the first black social work leaders, who founded a number of colleges and social work programs, and Teddy Roosevelt, going back to 1900. Where the family was looked at as a pivotal institution. So, we fast forward to today, and is anything any better? And quite frankly, I personally think that Moynihan got a lot right, but he got an awful lot wrong. And a lot of that had to do with his lens, the lens that was used to look at these dynamics at the time. And we are all bound by our own rationality. We do not have all the answers for everything, all right? And so at that point in time, it seemed pretty clear what needed to happen, even though this report was never meant to be public. But keep in mind, it was happening at the time of the Watts race riots, the civil rights movement. It was an extraordinarily dynamic time. So what do we have today? Well, if anything, things are worse. We have just a quick. I don't want to bore you with statistics, but over the since 1960, both parents Children living with both parents has steadily decreased from 85 to the low 60s. Percent of children living in mom-only homes is between 8 and 24%, and black children living with both parents compared to others is 85% for Asian, 75% white, 58% Hispanic. Education, 25 to 29-year-olds have increased their educational attainment compared to the 1971. 58% have some college, 88% have a bachelor's degree. And in 2013, 90% of 25 to 29-year-olds completed high school, and that's the total group. However, with race, whites have 80 I think right now we're at 90 to 94% completing high school, 90% of blacks, 76% Hispanic. College, 71% white, 56% black, 41% Hispanic. And the other issue here is, as we fast forward, and I found this interesting statistic that in 2012, people on Medicare, now these would be folks like me who were in our teens in 1965. The median income is roughly about $24,000 for whites, 15 for black, and 13 for Hispanics. Savings, $86,000 for whites, $11,000 for blacks, and $12,000 for Hispanics. Fast forward to the projections for 2030, whites will have $32,800 in income, $19,000 for blacks, $18,000 for Hispanic, and the savings would be $147,000 for whites, and $34,000 for black, and $35,000. So what does all this say? This says that there's enormous structural and institutional problems. And everybody values family. Has anyone ever met anyone who doesn't value family? But our policies do not reflect that. Our policies reflect individualism. And that's a tough nut to crack. But things are a lot different today. So I have a few more comments, but I'm going to stop now. That's the perspective, the bigger perspective on all this. So I'll pass that on to Carolyn now.
Okay, thanks a lot for that introduction. So you'll notice our focus here is a bit different on looking at the impact on families and how that looks over time. So do either one of you, do your comments want to pick up next? And we're looking again at structure. One observation I'd like you to keep in mind is that in studying families, we talk about family structure versus family function. So the structure, and I see the structures of family coming out in the Moynihan report very clearly. But the question that you might want to be thinking about as we talk is, what comments or what evidence is there that the functions of families are still being met in various communities? Okay, either one, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, okay. So I would like to address the structure of black families, urban black families, also Latino families, and as was mentioned, they tend to be single-headed households, mostly by single mothers. And I wanted to talk about, in addition to that, another layer of that is the social isolation of residents who tend to live in economically and socially disadvantaged neighborhoods. And what I mean by social isolation is the distance from mainstream institutions, lack of access to things such as adequate schools. With that comes a distrust for actors within mainstream systems, such as police officers, and all of that contributes to sort of a piling up of disadvantage. And I think in tying it back to the structure of family is that if you have youth and young adults who are emerging from these single-parent, poor households, where do they learn how to develop in healthy ways, right? If they're growing up in social isolation away from these conventional institutions, what alternatives do they have? In thinking about nutritional, educational, social outcomes, that within these communities there also tends to be high rates of crime. I think in terms of crime coming from a criminal justice background. And if you have individuals who are going out into their communities and looking for ways to obtain money because they come from poor households, and with that comes low levels of educational advancement as well, then they're likely to turn to crime. They're likely to look to their neighborhood peers who are often involved in a culture of criminal behavior. And that tends to be perpetuated through generations, especially when we're talking about the lack of a strong male presence and someone to sort of guide behaviors on the right track. And another important facet of that I would like to discuss is the spillover into educational systems. If you have youth and young adults who are attending schools that are located within these impoverished neighborhoods, research has shown that, just to take a step back, for instance, urban Black communities tend to be structured around aggressive regulative rules and that are used for guiding behavior. It tends to influence the development of aggressive types of behaviors, violent responses to real or imagined threats in the neighborhood. That's one way of acquiring social status, and as I mentioned, without proper guidance and direction, then that is one viable alternative that might be seen by children growing up in those circumstances. And adding to that, evidence also supports a theory that those types of behaviors will spill over into the school system, and in response, administrators will respond to that conduct using exclusionary types of punishments. Whereas the result is that students might feel, Black, Latino students who come from poor backgrounds in particular, might feel pushed out of mainstream school systems. And with that comes their access to healthy food options, right, like school lunches, and they're pushed back into their communities where crime is prevalent. So I think that it's important to look at the whole picture and how this cycle is perpetuated, not only how it's produced, but why it seems as if some individuals cannot break the cycle. It's important to consider the structural, cultural, as well as individual components that are part of the picture when you're thinking about nutritional and educational outcomes.
Thank you very much for the comments, because that segues in right into a clear example of nutrition, which is an important factor in this whole discussion. It is more of an illustration than a simple solution. So tell us what you have on.
Yeah, so one thing that Moynihan report doesn't talk about is access to food and good food, right? So how does that work? And one of the things that we know in this country is that not everyone has equal access to food, correct? Yes. And why is that? Either because it's not available, they just don't have, the food isn't available to them, or because they economically are unable to afford that food. Those are pretty much the two big reasons. And when an individual finds themselves in that situation, we call that food insecurity. So I'd like you to, if you can think about something that I'm going to say today, that food insecurity is kind of a big kind of point. And we know that about 14% of US households find themselves in some type of food insecurity. That sounds like a lot to me personally. Now, what does that mean? That might mean that a person has to skip a meal, not chooses to skip a meal. They must skip a meal. They don't have the money to buy that meal, whatever it is. It could be that they have to cut back on the amount of food that they eat, or the type of food that they eat. Maybe the quality of the food is less. They used to be able to have fresh vegetables. Now they have to buy canned vegetables, something like that. Or they rely on emergency sources for food. The family begins to go to a food bank, or maybe they go to a soup kitchen. They begin to rely on other sources outside the home for that food. And eating patterns can be disrupted. We know that minority households today are more than twice as likely to be food insecure as white households. Now, we've just come off an interesting time of the year, the winter, and winter puts another wrinkle in all of this because winter causes our resources to be redirected. Probably those of us up here know that it costs more to heat our house in the winter, and those bills start going up, and so you've still got to heat your house. Pipes freeze, right? And so if you've got to pay more money to heat your house, you've got less money for other things, and that might be a trade-off for food in some cases. We also know that about 60% of those food insecure homes use one or more of the following federally funded programs. And those federally funded programs are SNAP, which you might know as food stamps, WIC, WIC, which is Women, Infants, and Children, where there is a type of voucher for certain types of foods, and then the reduced or free school lunch and school breakfast programs. Those are basically the big three things. Now, there's local, of course, places to get food, as I mentioned before, a pantry, a shelter, or whatever, and people use those all of the time. We know that individuals who use school breakfast have an increase in school performance. And as the dean of the college, I'm really interested in having students do well. And not only here at the university, but in general, I'm interested in education, and I'm interested in just resource allocation. And we know that students who eat breakfast at school perform better on tests. They pay attention better, they are more engaged, they feel better, just healthy-wise, they feel better. They are less likely to have nutrient inadequacies. They're more likely to eat fruits and vegetables. And they're less likely to eat what most of us in this room would call junk food, because that, at this point, is not necessarily part of the school breakfast or lunch program. I wanted to give you a little background on that program. I realize some of you in here may have participated in those programs, but I think it's important for everyone to understand where those came about. The first pilot of school breakfast and lunch came about in the mid-60s, just after this Moynihan report, as a pilot. But they became a permanent program in 1975, so it took almost 10 years for that to happen. These programs are administered at the state level, not at the federal level. So the federal money goes to the state, and then that money is distributed locally so that the local districts, the local school districts in this example, would provide a food provider, would engage a food provider. And schools then receive cash subsidies for the food for each meal that they serve. They have to meet federal requirements, and they have to offer the free breakfast and lunch to eligible children. What is served is not federally mandated. So what is served is a local decision, but they need to meet the guidelines that are set out by the federal programming. You may also know that in 2013-2014, there was a change in those guidelines to increase more whole grain, to have more fresh fruits and vegetables. And there became some reports where it was difficult for students to transition to that type of food. It was unfamiliar, and that becomes part of this issue as well, providing food that is familiar and tastes good, as well as being nutritionally adequate. So what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is I'd like to look at today's menu for the Philadelphia School District. Okay? So you got to listen here because I don't have a PowerPoint slide. So today, March 18th, in the Philadelphia School District, this is what's on the menu for school breakfast, school lunch, and something that they also have is a cold dinner that can be taken home. So here's what's on the menu today. A student would have for breakfast vanilla yogurt, a banana muffin, sliced apples, fruit juice, and milk. Pretty good. For lunch, turkey and cheese on whole wheat bun, coleslaw, baby carrots, pear, and milk. Cold dinner. Turkey bologna, salami, and cheese on a hoagie roll with lettuce and tomatoes, sliced apples, animal graham crackers, and milk. Doesn't sound too bad. It's clear that there's adequate calories. What's missing? Yeah, there's no fries, right? But in terms of nutritional, what might be missing? Pardon me? Yeah. Yeah, other than the lettuce, there's not a whole lot of vegetables, certainly not green ones. And those green leafy vegetables provide some really important nutrients that are important for brain development and for cognitive function. So while we have this program, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, and I'm not disrespecting the Philadelphia School District here, so please don't misinterpret me. These programs are there. They serve a wonderful purpose and an incredible resource for families, but they have their shortcomings. Part of the shortcomings is what happens when there's a snow day. Right. What happens when it's Saturday or Sunday? Oh, yeah. Right. There are big issues here. So we've got some things, but we've got still some ways to go, right? So I'd just like you to think about it.
Thank you so much for the comments to begin our thinking. Did either one of you have comments or in response to anything that she said?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to the example Dr. Zayaitz gave regarding the menu. The answer to the question, what happens on a weekend, really goes back to, when policies are made, how and what is being considered when they're made. And my challenge to you would be, think of an example when a policy is developed and the consequences on the family are considered, as opposed to the individual. Quick case in point, we go to war, we send people to Iraq to fight terrorism, et cetera, what provisions are made when they come home and the impact on the family? As an example of that out of a welfare, but more into war policy, that's a good example of that. And it's the same thing with family functioning and family policy, because as students and as educators and as whoever else is in the audience, we have a role here in terms of impacting policy, and family policy in particular. Otherwise, nothing will change. It'll continue to be individualistic, along with its discrimination, its sexism, and its determining who gets what.
I just wanted to add to what Dean Zayaitz was saying regarding what happens on a snow day or on the weekend. I actually have a very short quote from some research that I conducted, and he was the person who this quote is from. It's a direct quote. He was incarcerated. He grew up in an urban disadvantaged community with 6 siblings, single mother, worked 2 jobs, so I would just like to share it with you. he told me, I sort of asked him about his pathway into crime and his family dynamics. And he said, I didn't want to be like the local drug dealer, but at the time I wanted to get money like the local drug dealer. So growing up, those were kind of those things. I didn't want to be like Julito, but Julito was getting mad money, and I had no money. My younger brother sometimes would be hungry, and I would say, I could get you money, I'll feed him, or whatever. And what he did was he went outside, and he grouped up with the local drug dealers that he was referring to, and he started selling drugs, and he was able to make money so that he could feed his younger brother who was hungry. So I just wanted to share that.
To kind of tie this together and to provide a larger picture, sometimes in the news we hear references to food deserts. So the recent ones I heard were in the city of Baltimore, but this occurs in all communities. You have large neighborhoods, quite large neighborhoods. The main source of food is corner stores. There's few large grocery stores. The characteristic of a corner store is that the owners need to make money, but things like fresh produce and fresh fruit spoil quickly, so you likely cannot find those kinds of items at that store. So the question for the panel is, in what way do these food deserts or the lack of access to wholesome food, how does that impact student behavior, family functioning, and community health? I mean, we're looking overall at community health. What would be your comments or observations? Like, why does it matter other than student grades? Or, are there larger issues here that are important? And then where does that change occur? The school lunch program is a fabulous example, but during the summer months, the times when the children are not in school, then what happens? Any comments on that?
I could just make a comment of fresh foods versus processed foods. So if I can just kind of take your first point here. Any food that has been processed, so if it's been canned or frozen or put in some other kind of packaging, there has been a loss of nutrients. The best nutrients we get are from fresh picked vegetables and fruits, without a doubt. Millions of studies have indicated that. With each day past harvest, those nutrients go down, and with each process, those nutrients go down. Processing adds other things. It might add salt, for example. Canned beans, for example, might have salt in. Why? Why would they have salt? Well, it's to inhibit the bacteria that might cause the food to spoil. Foods might have sugar added to them. Why? For taste or texture changes, or again, to inhibit bacteria. And so when we talk about processed food, we bring a lot of sort of extras to the plate that some of them taste good. I'm not saying that they don't taste good, and they may make our food look a certain way that we desire or we think we desire. But they're also bringing things that are not as equal, if you will, to that fresh food that could be there. Now, there are some programs. There are cities and local communities that have community gardens. Those gardens can be available for people in the small community, in those little desert community, to grow their own. And there have been a number of different programming situations for that. There are also programs where folks who have a garden can donate their extra produce, say to a food bank, or usually that's where it goes, to a food bank, and that can be distributed to individuals. But again, that's at least in this part of the world, it's a seasonal. We're not harvesting a whole lot of fruits and vegetables right now in March, right? At least not in Pennsylvania. But in July and August, we have so many tomatoes we don't know what to do with them, right? So you can kind of see where there might be some inequalities, there might be some availability, but again, it's not necessarily equal.
And in relation to that, just an aside, the study that came out like in the 50s, in the mid-50s, before the breakfast program was put into place, looked at children's behavior. And I should have brought the quote along, because the author of the study said that children who only have waffles and syrup for breakfast, now it's probably not too many of us anymore, but they had difficulty concentrating, and they demonstrated higher levels of what he termed saucy behavior, which I thought was an interesting term. So how many of our young children who are reprimanded for what we think is ADD or hyper behavior is related to nutrition and to access to healthy foods? So it relates directly to behavior. And then the example that you gave earlier of reading the menu, the district that my son is in has opted out of the breakfast program because so many children hadn't developed a taste for fruits and vegetables, and too much was going to waste. So they've opted out. And then that becomes an issue too. How do we develop a taste for healthy food and help people understand that it does impact our behavior in positive ways? We have time for some questions. Are there other comments from the panel before I open it to questions from the audience? There are questions from the audience on the topic of nutrition or some of the structural issues that we find in communities that impact development and family strengths and structures.
On my road to tenure, and this is at Cumberland County College many years ago in Vineland, New Jersey, I took it upon myself to try to institute the school breakfast program. Now, the principal of the school that my daughter went to said, "We're not responsible. They already get the lunch." And I said, no. You feed your kid in the morning. I feed my kid in the morning. We're talking about the kids. And I had to put up with a lot of static before we got it through. But the most hurtful thing about these programs was the kids had to show tickets. And there was a great deal of shame that children felt, and I felt personally, and it still hasn't happened, that everyone should have the free meal, and that way they can take it freely. Now, I got a call one day from the cafeteria lady, and she said, "Professor Pastor, you know your daughter's been eating the school lunch and the school breakfast. She doesn't have tickets, but she said she's hungry." And I thought, well, I'm very glad I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. She learned something.
Thanks for the comment. Are there other related questions or comments? And just an observation on that, there again, that's our school budget, that's what we as parents advocate for. In my son's system, it's a thumb scan. So he always wants to go for breakfast to hang out with his buddies, but when he scans his thumb, nobody knows if he's on free or reduced lunch. And it's those kinds of things. But often it's us as parents that have to push for that. It's going to take money. It comes out of our tax dollars. Another comment back here.
I'm a registered dietitian, and I was president of my local dietetic association 10 years ago when the East Penn School District made international news by sending home letters about to parents of kids whose height and weight put them above or below the ideal for the healthy range for their age and sex. Well, what ensued was East Penn instituted they were the second school district that had a nutrition policy, and Philadelphia was the first, and now it's a federal and state rule to have a nutrition policy. But it took a couple of years just to develop it, and about 4 years to roll it out. And registered dietitians were involved in this, many of whom lived in that school district, which is just south of Allentown. So where I'm going with this is the issue of the kids throwing away the food that's healthy. And we work very closely with the school food service company to develop the palate for healthier foods. To look at what was happening, too. Sometimes there wasn't enough time to eat. Even to get through the line, kids were eating the trays, like the football players would eat the food and then get more and pay once. There's all sorts of stuff that was going on, but some kids weren't even going through. But the idea of not eating healthy food, they really worked with that by introducing the foods one at a time, having taste sessions, just very creative ways. But it was a battle to get the kids to really want the better foods. And so they had a community, parent, student partnership. And everybody got involved, partly because it got so much news, there was so much focus, but that really worked where everybody got involved and discussed what was going to be on that menu. So I just want to share that.
Is there another question? One more.
I don't have a question, but more of a comment. I work with a summer food program in my local community, and when I had to go to a training about, what particular items should be served during different time periods, breakfast, lunch, dinner, as well as the fact that milk had to be served, different things like that. One of the other people who were there said that food was not being eaten by the kids because they were making food that the kids did not desire. So I think that might be also a problem in the sense that we're trying to get them to eat healthier, but you still have to kind of give them some things that are appealing to their taste of what they are going to eat, to kind of change up their mindset of what is good for them.
I think that's a really important comment, and that goes back to your comments that the nutrition is governed by the state, and so hopefully they can develop menus that appeal to local tastes and local tastes. Another question or comment? I want to back up a minute, and this may open another issue, but I wanted to make just a few general comments too about the definition of single parenting. And this comes from, again, research and family studies. And the one unfortunate thing is that single parenting has for so long been viewed as a deficit model of families. And I'm not sure that that's the case. In teaching family studies now, one of the structures that I include on a regular basis is the concept of families living apart together. It's an LAT family. So every year there's students who say, oh yeah, that describes my family. Mom lives in a house on this street, dad lives in a house around the corner. They've been together 25 years, but not under the same roof. But they're always at all of our events. The one girl said Dad's house was being remodeled for 2 weeks, so he moved in with Mom, and after 2 weeks she'd had enough. She sent him back to his place. It's like, oh, I don't want you living with me. But it's a family. It's a family. They support each other. They have a longevity. So I think one of the challenges for us is to look at how does family support occur. And we talked about communities earlier. And I think there's a tremendous amount of support that occurs that we haven't figured out how to recognize or how to affirm. So, because in the paper that this student wrote then, she said, well, the statistics show that married couples are happier. So I said to my dad, why don't you marry, aren't you going to marry Mom? And I said to her, no, you've missed the point. A 25-year relationship is stability, is health, is access to benefits, access to support, and so on. So I think in some ways we need to rethink how family functions are met, how we meet the needs of each other. There still continues to be concern, though, about what we call churning, where in a single-parent home you may have a number of partners in and out of that household over time. And that is a concern in that it does challenge the stability of the family and of children. Any other comments from panel members or from someone in the audience?
I'd like to just add a thought to that. The term that we use in research in my area is called feminization of poverty. And it's kind of sad we had to come up with a term. And the term is new. The Moynihan report predates it. But consequently, what we're talking about here is built-in discrimination against women. of an institutional type. And just take the facts, for example. 50% of marriages end in divorce. Most of the women end up with the children. Women make 76 cents less than a man. They're socialized into different types of employment. Comes time for Social Security, they make significantly less because of that. And so you put all that together, and a lot of people use a flawed character approach as opposed to an opportunity to restrict a discrimination approach in terms of what's wrong with the structure of the system that continues to do that. So we keep producing this mess, which has nothing to do with whether or not a woman can run a family or should run a family. And it has everything to do with having the same opportunities as everybody else. And that applies to, and it's even worse for black women. I think 50% of single-parent black families who are run by women are in poverty. And we're not even talking about working poor, just talking about poverty level and lower.
Question here at the front.
Yeah, it's going to sound like, so I'm just going to give the preface. It's going to sound as if I have an agenda, but I probably do, and I'm not aware of it. So here it is. And the question to you is, I come from an area where poverty is nothing new. In fact, I know more people who are impoverished than people who are wealthy. And while I'm very aware the Black Panther Party came up with the whole idea of the after-school the free lunch program, breakfast program. I do have a question. I do have a concern. Is that when you're talking about the feminization of the poor and you're talking about people who are impoverished, there is in this idea of creating a menu for them to eat. There is also understanding of what is appropriate, taking away freedoms and liberties that people who are more wealthy have. And so therefore, the byproduct of that is a level of hierarchy that is really is there, and it can even impact how one sees a citizenship or how one perceives what is appropriate. Now, just say that, and then I really want you to I want all of y'all to speak to this, because when I was growing up, I grew up in the South, and people ate greens. They had gardens and they cooked greens, but people were greens were considered old slave food, and it wasn't necessarily the top food to sort of eat. It was sort of the poor man's supplement in diet. But now the big rage right now is kale and greens and eat greens and so on and so forth. And so kale chips, whatever. So now you have this sort of, reimagining. You mentioned yogurt. Yogurt is, again, there is an idea of class associated with that. So I'm wondering, how does that, when we're talking about the impact on the learning, because you brought up the learning and the accessibility, and what does that mean? What is the informal curriculum? That's the question. What is the informal curriculum of these types of programs that can actually be detrimental? Not necessarily to the positive, but could actually be detrimental, because it goes. One of the young lady talked about how Julio, I think he said his name is Julio, that he was saying that he wanted to buy his brother something to eat, and surely he wasn't going to Whole Foods, he was going to McDonald's.
I think you're very right. So these programs are set up, and there's not a lot of choice. Today we're having this, and you will like it. Correct? And if you don't like it, well, then you won't eat. Too bad for you. And you're exactly right about that. I think a way that could be improved would be because, and I'm just going to talk about school breakfast, school lunch, because that's actually a local, it is actually a local event. Those menus are put together locally. That families could engage with the district, or the district could engage with families and say, what kinds of things could we put on that? Remembering that the school district only gets $1.58 per meal, which isn't much money, right? So I mean, you can buy things in, big quantity, but I think a lot. So it's a hard thing. So how can we provide food? And I think the students here would say the same thing about the university. How can we have more vegetarian choices? How can we have more vegan choices? How can we get that conversation going when everything looks fried and like pizza, kind of? I don't know. I don't know. Sorry. And I know you like it, but it doesn't necessarily, there are places for conversation. And I think fortunately, because these are structured at the local level, even though the funding's coming from here, there can be conversations. Could we have rice and beans once a week, if that's what this community really likes? Could we, have something else that would, and I'm not saying every day, but, and begin to slowly introduce some of these foods that might be unfamiliar. Philadelphia does have a program, it's called a fruits and vegetables program that I found out about, and they engage 10 elementary schools a year, that's all. So there's lots of schools that are not involved in this program. But they bring in different and totally different fruits and vegetables, and they have programming for students to try these different things. Maybe they've never tried coconut, for example, or even seen a coconut. It's those white things maybe they saw in a candy bar, right? But not that. So I think there is some education going on, and I think that communities do have that opportunity, but people have to be willing to engage in a conversation about it. And, like some of the parents here, speak out to say, can't we be part of that conversation?
If I understand your comment correctly, really I think what you're referring to is what is the unintended consequences of these nice acts or these nice policy decisions, in this case, the menu. Right? And I don't think the issue is the food. I think the issue is the access to the food. Let me choose. And it's too expensive, all right? And it's an economic, my position is this is an economic issue, not a food issue. And the equality of that, the equal access to that. That's what's at the heart of this particular problem, as to who can afford what. I mean, how many students here would say they eat healthy? I would say a minority. And is that because, my assumption would be, could be wrong, but because you're in college, you have resources to access healthy food if you want it. That would be I don't know if that assumption's accurate, but that's the choice you made. As opposed to, I gotta eat peanut butter, or I have to eat bread, or I have to eat the things that are gonna fill me up in a hurry and drive my sugar level through the roof, and I'll need it again.
How many of us on our way to PhDs had ramen noodles?
Right.
Come on.
Popeyes. 5 for $1.
Great, thank you so much for your participation. Is there an announcement then about the afternoon session? Because I think it's our lunch break at this point.
Ms. McPherson, what did you think about today's panel?
I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to discuss the things that we need to discuss, particularly related to race. They are such complex issues that there's never enough time to fully discuss it, but I think that planting the seed of the ideas of how people should reconsider their thoughts about situations is always an opportunity.
And what is one thing that you'd like the audience to leave here today after the panel discussion?
That we are still living in a society that needs to really think deeply about the legacy of slavery and segregation and its continuing impact on this country. That we still do not have an equitable situation, and we've got to work harder at it. And all of us have to play a role in improving the plight of those less fortunate here, because it is an issue that is going to continue for the long haul if we don't get a grip. You know, we have to make sure that there's an equitable funding formula so that schools are better resourced to do what they need to do for young people. And we also have to, and I don't want to give up hope. You know, a lot of times these things sound hopeless, but when we give up hope, then we lose the battle, and there's still so much opportunity out in front of us.
What did you think about today's discussion?
I enjoyed it. It was really effective. Like, they touched on some points I had never crossed my mind before. So it was really good to actually hear about them.
Anything in particular that stuck out to you the most?
One thing that did actually stick out to me was the fact that school districts only receive $1.58 for each meal, which is not a lot at all.
Yeah. So what did you think about today's panel discussion?
I thought it was very interesting. I never really realized, I'd never really researched or gotten to know about free lunch programs and things like that. I know about WIC and SNAP, but I never really got into the discussion of free lunch, and I thought it was really interesting to see how that can be the shortcomings of that program, and also to see how good it can be and how it addresses different issues. And I never really realized how much nutrition can affect how people would act versus more of the statistics versus the family structure. It was just really interesting to put all those little parts together and just see how it creates the whole and makes it different.
Awesome. Was there anything in the panel discussion that stuck out to you the most?
I would say definitely the nutrition part by Dr. Zayaitz. I thought that was definitely interesting because I'm a social work major. I like to look at different parts, and I wouldn't really think to delve into processed foods versus non-processed foods and how that can affect the differences in the performance of students and how that in turn affects the whole.